Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. We're going to take a little bit of a break from our work group and have a special treat today. We have a guest from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, sponsored by the Department of Energy. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know on the phone that the webinar is going to be recorded today. When we're complete with our activities today, we're going to have this posted on the website, the IRP implementation page that has all the agendas and the meeting information. We'll have this WebEx posted when everything is done. So we'll get right down to it. Today we have a special guest. His name is Tom Ekman. He's been a key figure in the history of electric resource planning in the Northwest. Tom recently retired as director of the Power Division of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. He remains affiliated with the council in an advisory role. He joined the council in 1982 and has over 35 years of experience in integrated resource planning and energy efficiency. He has conducted multiple comprehensive assessments of energy efficiency potential in the Pacific Northwest region, as well as assisted in the assessments prepared by and for utilities. He also chaired the council's Regional Technical Forum from its inception in 1999 through 2015. Today, Tom is here to provide us with an overview of integrated resource planning, followed by an in-depth look at modeling energy efficiency and demand response. Please join me in welcoming Tom Ekman.
Thank you very much. This is actually in three sections. The first section is sort of an overview of what's in an IRP. The brief session I had this morning, most of you will find this to be a tutorial on what you already know, but there'll be some aspects here that I hope, at least pictorially, you'll get a sense of how you might reveal that information so it's a little more transparent to your customers and stakeholders. So let's get started. This is the group that put this information together. Lisa Swartz is the leader of the team. Him and Andy Satchel are the two people at LBM session, and I'm in charge of the third part. I didn't go into it and the big meeting. How's that? Oh, yeah, that's what. Where can I stand to get feedback? Okay, my blocking folks view here. Let's get started. All right. The first session that we'll do for the next 40 minutes to an hour, plus questions. And by the way, you can ask questions as I go, so just raise your hand if I'm going too fast or the word I use doesn't make any sense or the sentence I use doesn't make any sense. The first elements, we're going to talk about what questions does an IRP address and what are the essential elements or components of an IRP. And then what are the major analytical steps that are involved in putting one together. That includes the type of models that we use, the role that each model might play in an IRP, and what are some of the critical assumptions or analysis that need to be done to get to the end game. So this is what a typical table of contents might look like for an IRP. Right? You have a resource strategy right up at the beginning, an executive summary, and the section 2, state of the system. So this is the context in which we're doing planning. These are the policies. This is the planning environment. These are the things that are happening to us right now that we think will influence or impact what we have to plan for. So, this morning we heard about the Clean Power Plan. That was a big issue in the preparation of the 7th Power Plan for the Council. It was underway at the time the Clean Power Plan was being discussed, so it's a major component and a theme through many of the IRPs that were done just prior to the last election. Resource strategy and action plan. Basically, the strategy is the mix of resources you're going to build over time, what you plan to build, and action plan, things that you have to do. I'll talk about most of these in detail. Then there's a whole bunch of analysis, the demand forecast, the price forecast, statement of what existing resources you have, and system needs, that is the low resource balance situation you find yourself in. Then the new resource potential, those are assessments of energy efficiency, demand response, generating resources, including utility scale renewables, and demand response resources. Then how you actually, the analysis, the last chapter is on how you actually did the analysis. So that's sort of the overview of the table of contents. I'm going to focus on parts of this morning in more detail. Then there's all the technical appendix. You don't have to read all those. I'm sure this presentation will be handed out at some point. But these are the kinds of things that you get into just to document homework. And there's a whole, appendix I, the environmental effects of electric power production. What are the impacts of each of generating resource types and demand response resources that you might build, and what constraints are placed on them by regulation. All right. So this is the fundamental problem faced. Are we back? Yeah. Thumb off that. It's a Goldilocks problem. Fundamentally, you don't want to have too many resources or too few. You just want it just right. And there's a very good reason that it's a Goldilocks problem. It's this. You have a balance of loads and resources. Resources on the left, and at the very top, at the margin, you're balancing those resources with market purchases, supply and demand in and out. On the other side, you've got loads that are there or not, depending on how good your load forecast is or how good the business cycle turns out to be. And your exposure to load volatility is important because you can overbuy or you can underbuy. So you've got these two have to be in balance with a little reserves. So the important thing is maintaining that just right position, because as you increase reserve margin, that is, get more resources than you might need, costs go up. If you aren't very good on the forecast and you underbuy, you increase risk, which turn out to be cost in the end. So that's the play you have to make. Find the bottom of the circle, the just right point. That's what IRPs tries to do. Now it turns out there's some problems in achieving that goal. All right. There are 6 questions that we have to answer on the way to getting to an IRP done. First is, when will we need resources? That's your load forecast. How much will we need? That's where you are right now, your loads resource balance, how fast loads are growing, what I own, what I buy. What should I buy to fill that gap? And when should I buy it? Up in there. How much will it cost to buy it? What are the risks associated with that? And then for the staff who's preparing the IRP, who do we blame when we get it wrong? And as a staff, that's a really important question to answer, and it's actually the first one that you have to answer. Okay, key components. You've got a load forecast. You've got a resource assessment, that is your balance, load resource balance position. You've got an assessment of your generating resource options, their cost and availability, the energy efficiency and demand response options, their cost and availability. You've got a resource optimization model, resource capacity expansion model. It basically generates a set of resource scenario portfolios that have the mix of resources going forward, both for energy and for capacity. And finally, you have an action plan that says, now that I know that, what am I going to do to make those things happen? And that's a really important endpoint, because there's where you tell everybody what you're planning to do over the near term to make that long-term goal occur. And finally, there's all those appendices that explain the analysis you did to get there. All right, let's talk about the load forecast. Load forecast is important, and it's particularly important to have more than one. This is a little bit of history. The council does resource planning under uncertainty, which I'll talk more about this afternoon, this morning. And we long ago forgot to do point forecasts. We don't have a high, medium, and low because we're never going to be on any one of those. So our analysis actually involves the creation of 800 futures. And we test every resource portfolio against those 800 futures. That's our analytical baseline. In this case, these are the 10th percentile, first, median, and third and 90th percentile of the load forecast across, those are the range of across 800 different futures, with the median being the middle. But we don't actually plan on the median. We don't have a reference case. All right. For the load forecasting folks that are doing IRPs, a couple things are important, particularly because the load forecast should not embed future energy efficiency necessarily, model it, but it does need to embed what we already know. Between 1992 and 2016, about 40 new standards were established. This is the pace of the standards that went into effect. Between 1992 and 2007, it averaged about 6/10 of a year, 6/10 of a standard a year, right? Going forward from 2008 to 2016, there were always 5 per year that went into place. Those standards going forward take effect over the next decade. They will significantly dampen load growth, and they will remove energy efficiency potential from your supply curves because they are captured by those federal standards. The reason that this time frame is important is if you have an econometric forecast that's based on the trend lines, the relationship between the variables that are independent and the load, which is the dependent one, it does not see what happened here. It's too recent because those things don't occur until later in the future. And your econometric load forecast will not know that those are going to happen. And so you will have a systematic overstatement of future loads. You need to recognize that in your load forecast. Just to give you an example, this is the regional load forecast on the mean for the Northwest, pre-energy efficiency, that is pre-standards, 1.15% load growth. For the standards published between 2010 and 2016, we dropped it to 0.9% load growth. For those going forward, we estimate that's going to drop down to 0.6%. So from 1.2 to 0.6, roughly a 50% reduction in the annual rate of growth from federal standards adopted since 2010, which your load forecasters haven't seen the effect of yet. Okay, generating resource additions. So you need to track what's happened, where your fleet is today, what's been added, what's been retired. This is capacity, so we do an inventory, basically. Here's what we got. This is what's going to stay. This is what's going to go. A forecast of existing resources. In terms of the net load position, this is the energy and capacity for the Northwest. So we see some retirement, we see some additions in the near term. Vertical axis here is plus or minus. So the fleet's going to get bigger by about 3,500 or so gigawatt hours of about 3,500 gigawatt hours a year of capacity generation. And then we've got retirements coming in 2020, another tranche coming in 2025, removing capacity. It's retirement of coal fleets, coal equipment in the Northwest. So you need to look at your load resource balance to see what your position is, your net position. That needs to be revealed, as well as your need for capacity reserves, various types. If you're integrating the balancing area, you've got net reserves to bring in renewables and balance your system out. This is just an indication of the peaking reduction on the hydro system in the Northwest being held back so we can integrate wind. It's a lot because wind moves around a lot, so you've got to hold something in reserve, and that takes your ability to use that hydro system in the Northwest to meet day-to-day fluctuations of load. It has to be there to meet changes in resource output, not load. Actually, the balance between the two. And a resource assessment. Now, this is a simple resource assessment. Gives you a high load growth band and a low load growth band and says this is what I own, and about right here, 2025, I don't have enough juice to make it happen. So I got something by 2025 I've got to build to fill the gap because under my high scenario, I'm not going to have enough resources to make it under loads. I get to 2035 before I need to build everything. So it's basically stack them up. Well, I own what's going to build, what am I going to build, and what I need to build on top of that. If you look at peak resources, the same kind of phenomenon, you just have different numbers. There's another way of doing this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on peak, it's the same graph. It's loss of load probability. It's a little more sophisticated look at your load resource balance position because it's a probabilistic look, not a fixed point. You don't look at your highs and lows. You look at the probability that weather or business cycle might move loads around an awful lot, that you might have unexpected forced outages in some of your equipment, that some regulation might impose limitations on the output. And as a consequence, you're looking at the probability of being, in this case, it's the loss of load probability, is I've got a 95%, in this case, is this, Northwest basis, it's probability, resource adequacy on a 5% loss of load probability. It means there's a 95% probability we'll keep the lights on, not 100%. So that would lead to overbuilding the policies that we have. And we can take extreme measures like interrupt people, large industrial contracts, to still meet loads. But this means before we have to take extreme measures, the governor gets on the phone and calls the media, we have a 95% probability of meeting loads. And you can see here, on this particular case, click the button right, that we're at 5% on the low load forecast. We're at 29% in 2020, loss of load probability on the high forecast. So we barely meet our adequacy standard in the low case. That means there's a fairly reasonable probability that we need to build resources in the next 5 years. We have some idea of the probability of hit, not just a fixed point. Because if your load forecast is a bit off, the resources get derated for some reason, you can be in low resource balance on average. If extreme conditions could kill you. So you want to look at more probabilistically. That's a better and more sophisticated look at it. And that may or may not be done as part of an IRP. There are other models that deal with this than the IRP capacity expansion model. But they feed the IRP and they need to be internally consistent. We'll talk about that later this afternoon. Natural gas fuel prices. These are the range of the fuel prices we've got at the extremes. Oops. Go back to natural gas price forecast. That's got to be in your portfolio of things to do. You need wholesale electricity price. Again, we've got ranges of those. So these are just revealing what your input assumptions are, so that everybody knows high, medium, low, expected case, or in our case, the range of the 800 futures we play with. Generating resource costs. So we've got, you're just racked up from low cost to high cost, a variety of generating resources that we looked at for the 7th plan. Their capital costs, their O&M, property taxes, insurance, and fuel and transmission costs in little bars, and you can see each one has a little bit different relationship to one another. This is for energy generating capability. And so you've got natural gas generation, and an Arrow combined cycle generator on the east side of where we have better access to natural gas, the most expensive. We get down here, solar PV is pretty cheap in Idaho, but there's a limited quantity of it. So this doesn't show quantity, but this just shows the relative cost. And so you're just stacking them up in what we conventionally call a supply curve of energy resources. So you get from low to high cost, and you want to look at each one of these because they have different amounts of risk. You have fuel price is a big deal. You've got a lot of fuel price O&M in here. So it's important to keep track of the components of the cost. Some are capital cost risk, like solar PV is all capital. Put the money in there, and things get really cheap. That capital could be wasted. You could buy something that's really gas intensive, fuel intensive, and prices go up, and that would be a bad idea. So you need to keep track of their component costs, not just their total cost in the modeling. Generating resources, this is peaking capacity. Just another look at the same kinds of things. Show transparency in the capacity of those, show transparency in the components of their cost. Energy efficiency, technical economic potential. This is what we call our supply curve for energy efficiency. It's split into 2 pieces. Levelized cost is down along the bottom. For those economists, the axis here, reverse P and Q split on the other way. Levelized cost on the bottom. The amount of energy efficiency that's a retrofit is on the top in terms of the bottom of the blue bars there, purple bars, starting at low cost or negative cost, and building out to over $140 a megawatt hour. And then we stack the orange bars on top of that, and that's our total supply curve. So when our resource modeling goes on, it goes out there and says, what can I buy for $10 a megawatt hour? What can I buy for 20? It looks at those stacks and says, that's how much you can get. Now, there's some other constraints we'll talk about later about how fast you can get this, and that has to be modeled as well. So, quick summary here. All your resources come to a capacity expansion model in the best of practices where they compete with one another. Energy efficiency, demand response, and generating resources, moving renewables, compete against one another because that's the optimization that has all the pieces of the equation in it. Demand response, same kind of thing. Let's see, we'll get there. You can view the mist not saying that to miss the particular part, that energy efficiency has a load shape. It's not flat. And as a consequence, here are 3 or 4 of them, 4 load shapes. And this is 24 hours of the day, a summer day, and a typical load shape of demand for those particular end uses: residential AC, residential lighting, residential water heating, and commercial lighting. Each one of them has a distinct load shape, and it either does contribute significantly to the peak load of the day, or it doesn't. But over the 87, 60 hours of the year, it has a kW demand on the system unique to that particular end use. And when you touch it with energy efficiency, it will change that load shape. It will bring it down or shift it in time if you add controls. So as a consequence, it has a capacity impact on your system. And when a capacity expansion model is looking for both energy and capacity, it needs to understand that and characterize energy efficiency so that it recognizes that it provides both energy and capacity. If it doesn't do that, it's missing a piece of the fidelity it needs to make the right decision. And we'll get to that a little bit more this afternoon. This is the supply curve by time. So we've got year across the bottom axis this time, not money. The vertical axis is made up of wedges of amount of resources at different price bins. So from 2016 to 2024, this is the amount of resource in gigawatt hours per year available at $10 a megawatt hour, at 20, at 30, on up, whatever the code is there. You can see that you can't get it all at once. Some of it's available all today in retrofit form, but some of those things like refrigerator replacements don't happen but a certain amount every year and not available until the house is built. So it's there in the future, but it's not available today to get. So you can't treat retrofit in the modeling enterprise like you treat new building construction. Those opportunities are available out in the future on an annual basis. Retrofit, you could go all today if you could leverage the infrastructure to make that happen. So again, a fidelity question in the modeling. All right, here's the demand response. Again, enter, pushing the button. Demand response, price bin. We show it because it's competing directly with other capacity tools or other capacity resources in the modeling. We have this type of program and a set of bins, similar programs and cost programs, providing capacity benefits. This is all peaking capacity benefits at varied cost. And we've got, in this case, 4 different bins that we modeled in the 7 plan, but you can split them a lot more, greater fidelity or less. Oops. The bars there are the averages. So you've got, auto DR, lots of load aggregator doing auto DR. You've got somebody with a switch out there. Various types of programs, irrigation pumping, which you have in the Northwest, not so much here. All right. And the context. This is a slide from the 7th plan. We had coal retirements in our region. That was part of the context. Effectively 5 units being shut down over the next 10 years. So that was a big issue. We had resource reductions in the existing fleet. We had at the time, as I said, Clean Power Plan coming at us. We had to deal with compliance with that across 4 states, 3 of which have no coal plants and 2 of which do, and 1 of which does, most of the coal plants. And then we have the fact that our summer loads are growing faster than our winter loads, and we used to be, still are, a winter peaking utility system in the Northwest, but we are gradually becoming a summer peaking utility, and that presents different problems for capacity because the river is drier in the summer than it is in the winter. So, the issue there. So this is a general description of the environment you'd be planning in. Right. Council did over 26 or 27 scenarios. I wouldn't expect everybody to do this, but that was the game plan we ended up with. We had an existing policy. I'll just give you a sense of the range of scenarios you might develop and test. Existing policy, no change, just business as usual. That's what it's typically called. Ours is existing policy. Social cost of carbon, we talked about that this morning. And what we selected was we took the interagency working group social cost of carbon estimates, and we say, okay, at one end we've got their median estimate, which starts at $40 a ton and runs out to 60. At the extreme, we have Another one that's their 95th percentile estimate of social cost of carbon, which is the damage estimate of the federal government. And it starts at about $160 and runs up to $190 over a 20-year period. And they have a price, published prices that go out to 2050. So they're an external source that you can cite for carbon prices and say, what would happen if we tried to recover those damage costs, built a system that reflects those damage costs, and tried to avoid those damage costs? What would happen? So we had a couple scenarios with the social cost of carbon deal. We had to just retire coal, get rid of the coal fleet in the Northwest. We had to retire coal and inefficient natural gas. Take those old units that had heat rates above 8,000 out of the fleet. Just use more modern units. Retire coal and oppose the social cost of carbon. We get a sense here, we're trying to pound carbon out of the system because that was a big deal. So that was sort of, what can we do with current technology was the next one. Retire coal, impose the social cost of carbon, and not allow any gas to be built. Incremental development of resources only with renewables. Then you got to operate the system. Stakeholders asked us to run this, so we did. Run a regional RPS at 35%. The Northwest ranges between 0 in some states up to 50% in Oregon. So the regional average of about 35%. Run without demand response in the portfolio as an option. Increased market reliance. The Northwest does a lot of trading on the market with California, summer to winter. They peak in the summer, we peak in the winter. We can buy capacity on the California market because of big intertie connection. And instead of doing demand response or energy efficiency for that matter, we can buy surplus out of California on occasion if the wires are available. So we looked at increasing our market reliance and see if that was an economic choice, was a risk choice or not, some of the question. And finally, limit energy efficiency, just buy up the current market prices. That was a bad outcome, but we'll talk about it in detail. All right, this is what the resource modeling process looks like. You take all those things I talked about earlier, your load forecast, your price forecast, your supply curves for generation, your supply curves for energy efficiency, your supply curves for demand response, your carbon prices, and you put them into resource optimization model of some sort, capacity expansion model. It does its thing, and it generates some analysis that says, here's the net present value of that portfolio across multiple futures or across a single future. Use that information to inform the resource mix that turns out to be your preferred resource mix going forward, and then the action item plans fall from that. So all of those things feed into resource analysis model. So, and then it's presenting the findings. I'll back these up a little bit because it's a little fast. There we go. These are the kinds of charts and graphs that we put in the plan for public presentation to help explain to policymakers what was going on. I won't spend a lot of time on those, but they basically show trend lines. Up in the upper corner here is just a summary of the net present value, cost, and risk of each of some of the major portfolios. This is the sampling. This just shows, in this case, the annual coal dispatch by scenario. So we're comparing across scenarios, not within one. We're saying under this scenario we saw coal look like this, and we saw coal run all the way out in the existing policy case. It drops a little bit as retirements take place. If we reimpose the social cost of carbon in 2016, then coal dispatch drops immediately to this level and then drops a little bit more as some of the resources are retired. So there's a way that we can track what's going on by scenario.
On the graph you were just showing, for each scenario, we have a single line, and so I was wondering, were you using a Monte Carlo analysis?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the 800 futures. I'll talk about that a little bit this afternoon in the next session about how we actually do the Monte Carlo modeling. But it's 800 futures, each scenario is tested against 800 futures, and those are Monte Carlo driven. Right. So, but these are the kinds of displays that we tried to present so we could explain to the policymakers, the council members, and to the stakeholders what was going on, what was driving what happened to individual types of resources and things like carbon output, which is down here someplace. In this case, this lower left-hand block shows the probability of developing so much conservation by 2021. So we were interested in, for our action plan, how much energy efficiency should be developed under the scenario we're looking at based on the 800 futures that we test. So some cases you have low load growth, some cases high. Some cases you have high gas prices, some cases low. And so these are just distributions of the amount of energy efficiency built over those 800 futures, across the 800 futures. So it's just, instead of a normal graph, you get one that's skewed. In this case, it stops throughout the year. In the mean case, median case, mode case, top of the list, and the mode case here. So you have three different scenarios, all with different distributions, and the range across those help the decision makers determine how sensitive to setting a conservation goal of X is setting that goal at X. So back here.
Yeah, Tom, going back to the supply cost curve that you had for the different technologies, I noticed you had integrated transmission upgrade costs in there. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because that's not something that usually I've seen done in IRP modeling by utilities. Thanks.
Sure. In those bars, there was a section for transmissions. And some of those resources were only available if we did transmission expansion, high voltage transmission, to get access to them. So we built that cost into acquiring that resource. So we have things that are on the west side of the Cascades have robust transmission access. So it's only interconnect cost that you deal with. But if you've got a solar farm located in far southwest Idaho, we've got to put a 230 line out there to get to it, and or if we've got wind in western or eastern Montana, we've got to expand the Cross Rockies transmission to get there, 500 kV to get to that resource. Or we've got to close a coal plant to allow that line to take on the wind. But that's not likely to happen, so we're going to be looking at adding that transmission cost. So it's a part of getting that resource. And we need to reflect it. If there's just network additions for access, that's built into site specific, but that whole resource pool wasn't available without transmission expansion.
Question on the phone, shouldn't storage be taken into account as a resource?
Yes, and for the Northwest, storage is a huge hydro system we have. Batteries can't compete with that, so we didn't look at it in detail. But yes, if you have storage, and the technology available, we looked at an advanced technology scenario where that was available, but when all of our conventional looks at things, it wasn't in the money. So we did look at it, but it didn't show up on those graphs because it was never in the money except for in the extreme cases at the prices we saw 3 years ago. Over here.
Hi, can you go back to the list of scenarios? Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about the one that says retire coal, impose social cost of carbon, and no new gas?
Okay. Well, it did what it said. We retired all the coal fleet in the Northwest over a period of time. We imposed the social cost of carbon throughout the entire Western Interconnect. So the assumption was that our market prices, both sale and buy, would reflect the social cost of carbon. And we restricted the model's ability to buy anything except renewables, wind and solar.
Did that include building transmission to get more renewables into the area?
Yes, it did. Where we had solar PV and wind, it had to be, those were the eastern Montana wind and the solar PV in southwest Idaho, both require transmission additions, so those are built into the cost.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Right. You end up with some graph like this in the end, or multiples of these. These are just the resource mixes that we saw in the 7th plan by type. So this is resource additions by year, cumulative, on the vertical and the year on the horizontal axis, year on the vertical axis, amount for energy and capacity, energy on the right, capacity on the left. Oops, just reverse. Looking at right is capacity, left is energy. And we see On the capacity side, you see demand response showing up as a wedge, whereas on the energy side, demand response doesn't show up in the list. Wind and solar show up on the energy side. Renewable resources have a little wedge on the capacity side, very little wedge. The solar PV provides summer capacity, but the wind does not. Martin? Yes. That's right.
And am I correct in interpreting this to say essentially new generation resources do not appear until about 2025?
That's right. The first new gas generation shows up around 2025, 2026 online. And that's largely happens with the second tranche of retirements of our coal plants that are already scheduled. So we see some capacity need in 2025 because we lose 2 more coal plants at that point in time. And they're replaced by new natural gas. The energy efficiency basically carries the base load beyond at that point. It's about, this scenario is the social cost of carbon median case. So it runs embedded in this scenario, both results here is a $40 ton carbon starting point and a $60 ton carbon ending point. Yeah.
Energy efficiency provides the bulk of energy and a good chunk of the capacity too. At the very beginning of your presentation, you were showing a slide talking about federal appliance efficiency standards really driving a lot of efficiency. Is that included in the orange area?
No. The first wedge, the energy efficiency standards developed by the feds through the end of 2015 are reflected in our plan, which was published in 2016. So we embedded those in the assumptions of the load forecast. So they were netted out of the load forecast going forward. So they dropped us from the 1.2% load growth to the 0.9% load growth on the median case. And so they're already netted out. This is energy efficiency beyond. Some of that orange will be captured by those federal standards adopted in 2015 and beyond, or 2016 and beyond. So we won't necessarily have to acquire those through programs, at least in the long run. But yeah, I think the important point here is there's a big orange wedge over here of the capacity benefits of energy efficiency. Now, this is unique to the Northwest system, but it's probably not the only way it would affect this region of the country as well. Energy efficiency has both capacity and energy effects, and you need to account for both of them. It turns out it has some real advantages because it comes with energy and capacity when you buy it. It doesn't just come with an energy resource. You're buying 2 things with that resource. And if you have need for both energy and capacity, it's a good thing. If you have need for just capacity, it can also be a good thing. Bang on its price. Okay? So, and an action plan. This is the first thing that you think about when you build a portfolio, and the last thing you do when you have a portfolio. It's how we're going to make that happen. And generally it talks about preferred resource portfolio, what we intend to have as goals for development of EE and DR and generating resources, including the need for new ancillary services, if we have any, reserves and for reliability, transmission and distribution additions that you might have to take, and any risk management actions you might want to take. In the action plan, there's also non-resource development. There may be some analytical capability you need to develop for the next time you do an IRP. Or there might be some data development you need to do for the next time you do an IRP. There's always, I wish I had data about this. For example, the Northwest on a regular basis goes out and does a new housing characteristics survey, an existing housing characteristics survey, and an existing commercial buildings characteristics survey. So it can say with some certainty what the state of the existing building stock looks like. So when it can make better estimates of how much energy efficiency potential is actually remaining to achieve. If you don't do that, you're flying blind. So those recommendations are embedded in our action plan. Please do X amount of research. So the data will be there the next time, so we don't have to guess. And research and development on emerging technologies. So is there some pilot programs you need to run, some sort of information you need to gather to track what other people are doing to help you build your portfolio for the next time you do an IRP. So those are big, major components of the process. I think we'll just get into the process of development, find that out. So you're probably at this point right now, many of you, establishing the key values for the key inputs. You need to know what those key inputs are, and then come to some agreement of what those values are. Major issues that are going to drive you: is carbon an issue? Is the recovery of the economy an issue? Are the federal standards an issue? Estimate future loads and resource cost and availability. All of those go into the conducting of the resource portfolio analysis. You identify resource needs. This is a summary of what I've been talking about. Test alternative resource strategies and agree on a preferred portfolio for publishing in a draft IRP. Draft IRP goes out. You take public comment. Take that back in. Do another round of analysis, and finally issue a final IRP based on stakeholder input and management decisions. So that's a very schematic. Let's get into a little more detail. So in best practices, you start with a demand forecast, these are the components, and an energy efficiency and demand response set of supply curves, a resource assessment, a generating resource assessment, and in that I would include utility scale renewables. The non-utility scale renewables are probably up in your energy efficiency demand response discussion. So the distributed PV and DG might be up in the upper right-hand corner here, and the utility scale stuff is down at the bottom. You've got distribution of key drivers. What does my load forecast range look like? What does my fuel price forecast range look like? What does my coal price forecast range look like? What does my market price forecast range look like? Put that into your resource analysis model. From the load forecast, or from the demand forecast, you get a load forecast range without new energy efficiency and demand response. So this is treating energy efficiency as a competing resource, so it's not in the load forecast incrementally. And that's a word in the state about how to deal with that. From the load forecast, you also get the number of units in the baseline use. So this assumes you have an end-use load forecast or a statistically adjusted engineering model where you can actually point to the number of dishwashers you have and the energy used per dishwasher. If you have an econometric forecast, you can't do this. So you can't use the econometric load forecast to drive your assessment of energy efficiency resources because you don't have the fidelity of the information to do that with. So you have to do some other things, which I'll talk about later, in terms of calibrating the energy efficiency assessment with your demand forecast. And that's an important point so that you don't undercount or double count opportunities.
How would you have a load forecast range without new EO or DR? What if you had a mandated 1% a year savings program? How would that show up in your electricity demand forecast?
Yeah, that was the footnote I was going to add when I got done with the graph, so it's a great question. If you've got an ERS, or a minimum mandated level of energy efficiency, there's a couple decisions you have to make. First is you can load that in as a must-build resource into the load forecast, so it comes off the top. The question is, what comes off the top? Because if you're also doing an assessment of the remaining resource potential, you have to decide, say it's a 1.5% per annum target. What makes up the 1.5%, and then what's in the remaining opportunity pack? So you have to make a decision about, do I say that the cheapest stuff is all in the 1.5%, and I'll go only look at the more extreme prices, and that's what's remaining to be built, or I'll have a mix of resources in the 1.5%, and I'll also have an opportunity. It's just a matter of depth as opposed to price. So I'll look at all resources, but I'll only build 1.5% in there, and the remainder will have all price levels in it, or it'll only have prices above what takes me to 1.5%. My advice is to do the latter. That is, you spread it out, because all programs typically buy multiple measures at different costs. So trying to restrict it to a cap in the 1.5% doesn't make a lot of sense. It says, I will just so deep, because there's so much out there. When you look at the supply curves, the question is, how deep can I go in a year more than how far up the supply curve I can go? Because there's, as I showed you, we had to constrain our resource acquisition model to buy only a certain amount of retrofits a year. Otherwise, because there was so much cheap stuff, it would buy all of that was less than the dispatch cost of the next resource. So it tried to build, 20,000 gigawatt hours a year worth of savings. And we said, well, you can't get all that in 1 year. The infrastructure won't support it. So you're already going to be dampening down what you can buy to some level. And I think just taking a piece of the supply curve away, 1.5%, and letting it compete across the full range for the next chunk is the way I would do it.
Just out of curiosity, do you have a significant amount of electric heat?
Yes. Yeah, but much less than it used to be, about 35% market share. Gas is 45, 50. And then there's wood. You live in the west, where it's street. Okay. Did that answer, Paul? Supply curves, again, from DR and EE go into the resource analysis model. Your generating resource cost availability go in the resource analysis model, and the data to create futures goes into your resource analysis model. This is where the Monte Carlo comes in. We have distributions of all those key drivers. Each future, there's a draw of each driver. It creates that future. And you test the portfolios in a set of 800 of those. Management views the output of that along with the analysis. You draft some IRP portfolios, test them, and send them out and let people look at them, and then finally make a decision on it. That's the schematic on the analysis section. Now let's talk about time. All right. Ours typically takes 2 years. I think we did the last plan in 15 months. We did the first plan in 11. I wouldn't advise for public health doing it that fast. It makes you a lot older faster, but something on the order of 18 months to 24 months is a reasonable time frame to get this to happen. Let's talk about some milestones here. So early on, you need to get your financial assumptions down. What discount rate is going to be mandated or picked? You can argue for 2 months or 24 months on that, but get it done early. Don't change it. Some of those other financial assumptions about, okay, who's going to pay for the cost of resource development? It's important going in. For example, in our region, we have mostly vertically integrated utilities. So they're either the resource generation is going to be owned by a company that's either an industrial utility or a co-op or a PUD or a municipal. They have different financing profiles. So the cost of new generation, you have to make some call about what the investment portfolio looks like for the cost of new generation. Who's going to build the wind projects? Are they going to be private developers and they're going to come to you with a PPA? Or are they going to be utility-owned resources? In which case they're going to have different financial costs. PPA, you can assume they have different returns on than if you own them. The cost of capital for a private developer is different than the cost of industrial and utility. So you need to settle on a bunch of financial assumptions, not just a discount rate, that have to do with what your resources are going to cost. Who's going to build them, for example? Natural gas price range is important, I suspect, for you folks. Coal price range as well. Wholesale price range, really important. And a load forecast range. Those are the building blocks about a lot of things that happen downstream, and they need to be picked out and agreed to early. You complete a resource adequacy assessment. My load resource balance needs to be done fairly early on. Where are my needs? Capacity, energy, ancillary services. That sort of set the stage. I got load forecast, I got my load resource balance, and I got the inputs to futures like fuel price and market price, major inputs. Complete around, takes about 11 months or so to do a full assessment of energy efficiency and demand response. If you really take your time at it, you can do it a lot faster. You can say it's going to be 15% and be done with it. Some do. But you need to get your generating resource portfolio resources together as well. Demand response, all those costs that I showed on that chart earlier. And agree on the draft scenarios about that point in time. So before you get to a year out, you've got all your scenarios pretty well tied down. which one I'm going to run. Now, I will tell you that this is never a final. Because as soon as you run 2 or 3, you discover you should have run something else. So they are draft at that point. We have 2 rounds. We did 25 or 8, I think, scenarios in the end. We did 14 for the draft plan, and we did another 11 or 12 for the final plan, between draft and final, that we recognized we missed some things or need to fine tune some. So it took a lot more work than we thought between draft and final, but it was important to get those done because they answered a lot better. The questions much better. So got to tie those down. And then you simply conduct a bunch of analysis, and it can take 1 month, it can take 3 months. Get your resource strategy together and an action plan together, get your draft out at about month 19, maybe 15, depending on how fast things go. You got a bunch of public comment, revise your IRP, and finally go to final. I think Joe has a point.
I just wanted to ask a question about the 800 futures. Are those all of the different combinations that you can make of fuel price forecast, wholesale price forecast, load forecast, or how are those 800 futures constructed?
If you look back at that chart, I had all the inputs, and every one of those had a distribution. So you've got a load forecast range between negative growth and plus 2.5, and it's a distribution, and you can assign a probability to that, or you can make it flat. Doesn't matter. You can make a triangle, but it's making sure that you cover the range, and you can have a most favored point. You can pretend you know the future, and therefore have a mean value. Give it a normal distribution with your point as the mean. If all of your distributions are the mean, don't bother, because you come back with an answer that's the average. So what you want are distributions that reflect the range of risk that you might be exposed to, so that you have gas prices that go to the extreme, because they have. You have load forecasts that go negative, that go positive, and that's the point of doing those. We'll talk more about them certainly in the next second. All right, here's some models. We use load forecasting model. Econometric models are the most typical. They suffer from a problem because you really can't tell what's in them when you do your assessment of energy efficiency and demand response, but they are simple, cheap, and highly used, so I won't disparage them because they're cheap. End-use econometrics are a step up from that, where you actually have some fidelity down into the individual end uses, what they look like. Their benefit is you can actually tie your load forecast to your energy efficiency assessment. You have the same number of units, you have the same baseline consumption, and you can reflect in detail what's going on. And that helps program. It helps when you look for program administration, helps them apply those things as well. Close cousin of those are statistically adjusted engineering models, which are a step up from econometric, or a step between econometric and use econometric, where you have aggregates as opposed to individual end uses. You might have space heating as an aggregated end use, as opposed to gas space heating, electric space heating done by heat pumps, electric resistance, et cetera, et cetera. Water heating done by X, Y, and Z, you just have a water heating block. So there are ways to get some better fidelity out of that. That's a big component. Its principal benefit is that these kinds of things are much better to tie the load forecast and the energy efficiency assessment together than the econometric. Beyond that, it creates a way to expand the range and have it internally consistent. So you shouldn't get a high forecast and a low forecast, and the numbers of units associated with the high forecast and the low forecast. Capacity expansion model, that's the big one. Likely the companies already have these. So I'm not going to I'm not going to recommend a particular one or not. There are lots of those. There are commercial ones. I've listed several. Aurora System Optimizer, the FlexDose model. We have our own regional planning model. NREL has a resource planning model that it uses. The key differences between the models are how they treat uncertainty. Does the model create a set of futures, or does it have a single future around which it optimizes? That's the principal point of risk analysis, is that if you know the future, there's no risk. And many of the models have perfect foresight. That is, for every particular future, they create the optimum portfolio for that future. In contrast, other models test a portfolio against an unknown future. And they have what's called their agent-based. That is, they make decisions like people do as the future unfolds. And they can decide when to build a resource as the future unfolds, as opposed to, I will build it in 2018. Or I might build it I'll be ready to build it in 2018, but if loads don't grow, I'll push it off to 2019 or 2020. If loads do grow a little faster, I will have to do something to respond to that. And if I test enough futures, I'll have some idea of the probability that that will be the right date to build. Time resolution. A lot of the IRPs have big time steps, monthly, quarterly, annually. They don't deal with hour-to-hour dispatch because it takes a lot of computing time to make that happen. Some do. Some can make that as an approximation. And if you're trying to do DR and capacity in an IRP, having that time resolution is important. Question over here.
I have a question on the phone. Please ask how locational information about distributed energy resources might best be incorporated into IRP. One of my concerns is that assuming territory-wide distribution of DER trends to ignore locational value. Maybe our presenter can relate what is presently happening in California, plus also perhaps Hawaii, New York, and elsewhere to make progress in the geographic granularity of IRP.
Yeah, okay. It's a big step analytically to go from what a traditional IRP does, which basically locates resources generically, to one that actually looks for specific locational attributes, because that's more akin to what we have done for distribution planning. And the models, the IRP models, are not set up to do that because they don't have the time resolution, which is the point I've been talking about, nor they have the geographic sensitivity to that, because they have rudimentary transmission modeling in them and no distribution modeling. Follow-up question.
Yeah, Tom, with respect to your supply cost curves that you have to develop those early on, how do you basically account for technological maturity of certain resources? An example would be, we've seen wind costs go from about $140 a megawatt installed now down to roughly $35, $40 a megawatt installed. And we didn't obviously capture that initially when planning was going on 5-6 years ago. The other number was used. How do you account for that within the construct of IRP so that you can basically capture that risk?
Okay. I thought you were going to tag on to the comment on distribution. Let me finish that one and I'll get right to it. The California work that's being done, let me explain what they did so that you know what the lift is to make that happen. For PG&E territory, they got the AMI data for every meter. So they have a load shape for every meter in PG service territory, which is about a third of California. And they took analytically, LBNL actually did this work, took analytically, and they classified each of those within each of the jurisdictions. They took sort of like neighborhood by neighborhood. They took and drew a line around those AMI meters and classified their load shape, and also tied that into a bunch of other GIS information with respect to solar availability, transmission, distribution constraints, and things like that, and rolled that up into an analysis of where distributed resources would be the most beneficial on that system. It was a big lift because, first of all, it took getting multiple years of meter-specific locations of AMI data to look at the load profiles of every one of those buildings, every one of those meters, and aggregating those meters so that they look, because you might have multiple meters at a single premise. So getting those tied together to represent the premise so that you could actually say, if I dispatch a DR into that building, what would it look like? It looks like 5 meters in it because of multi-occupants. So there's a lot of work in that. I think it's great work. I'm sure LBNL would like to do it again for myself. I'm a consultant to them. I didn't do that work, so I'm not, there's no business case for me here. But it's it's a lot of work to get the locational stuff right. We're just at the beginning edges of making that happen. It ought to be done. There's a real benefit to making that happen. It's a lift. It's like we were in doing supply curves in 1982, because no one's done one. So, to the question of technological change and the impacts on cost expectations, 2 points there. One's personal, one's analytical. I'll go to the analytical first and then editorial. The analytical is that you can build those into your distributions if you're doing scenario analysis. You can take and say, okay, what if I've got technological maturity at this pace versus that pace, and what does that mean for the decisions I have to make today? If it goes sort of a threshold question, if it moves down from 500 to 250 to 125, and it makes 125 in 5 years, would I change my decision today? If it doesn't, would I change my decision today? Find that break point. And so you can get an analytical discussion going on about, and how likely is it that that's going to happen, and what would I do differently if it does? If it doesn't matter, then you hope it happens, but it doesn't matter. The personal thing is that it's rare when we find a technology advancement that happens so fast that we don't see it coming on the typical IRP cycle. IRPs are updated roughly every 2 years. I don't know what they are in the state, but that's typically what the Northwest utilities have to do. And you're basically on a constant treadmill of updating your IRP. So somebody's out there looking at technology advancement pretty quickly, and the resource commitment lead times for new generation are in the order of 2 to 5 years these days. They're not 15-year builds. And that really changes the decision time frame, how good you have to be about long term. Before, when we had 12-year build cycles, 15-year build cycles, you had to really be good, perfect almost. Otherwise, things got bad. And so we're saved by that, which is a point I'll make later this afternoon. But that's my quick answer, right? Global capacity expansion models. I pay great homage to modelers. I am not one, but I pay great homage to them. It's a lot of work. And they do things very well. They test alternative resource mixes and their timing. They help you develop resource strategies in an analytically consistent way, systematically. They can test a range of future conditions, low growth natural gas prices and emissions costs and limits, all kinds of things you want to test. And they can identify the least cost resource strategy, and they may also account for the risk of doing that strategy. What they don't do is decide what's an acceptable level of cost, because least cost is in the eye of the beholder. Depends on what that portfolio contains. The least cost solution to housing is a tent. That's probably not what everybody wants, but it's the least cost solution. So you have to be careful about what you buy for that cost. And policymakers have an override button on that when they say this is what's acceptable as a cost. They don't determine the level of acceptable risk. Everyone has a different risk tolerance. Otherwise, the stock market wouldn't work. And as a consequence, determining the acceptable level of risk is a subjective kind of thing, as is cost. So saying it's the least cost, least risk answer is not what the model does. It's what policymakers do. So there's a button that overrides what happens here that stakeholders and policymakers have to come to agreement on. It's not just the model output. And finally, they don't decide what's preferred. People do. So I'll leave it there. Brief comment, yes. Stakeholder engagement. We're going to talk about this a lot more. There used to be and there is now. And the picture on the left is the used to be, and the picture on the right is the what's now. Stakeholder engagement is going to come up at the next session that LBNL helps you with. And Natalie Mims will be here talking about that in much more detail. So you'll get a full discussion of I'll talk a little bit about in the next session about at the end about what other states do with stakeholder engagement, but you'll get a much more fleshing out of how we get broader understanding. I'll tell you from 35 years of experience, solid encouragement of stakeholder engagement buys you a better answer and buys managing implementation with a lot less conflict than ignoring it. So I'll just editorialize on that. If you're sincere about it, it takes a lot of work, however. Question here.
Our legal standard in Michigan for an IRP is that the end result of all this is approving a plan that is most reasonable for most. Care to comment on the achievability of that?
I'm not a citizen of the state of Michigan, so whatever you guys can come to agreement on is most.
The regulator has to.
The regulator's got, well, the regulator and the bodies that the constituencies that affect the regulator. The regulator doesn't work in isolation. At any place I've ever been, they seem to be talked to by other people. So.
On the phone. Is the best idea for now about locational values to, 1, identify a capacity expansion plan, then 2, do a locational DER analysis to determine whether a non-wireless alternative is preferred?
Yes, I think that's a good path. When you know you have locational hotspots that you might look at with a non-wireless alternative, it's better to look at those in detail. There is, however, one should keep in mind that while location matters to the real estate industry and to distribution networks, the effect of demand response on capacity needs is different than the effect of energy efficiency on capacity needs. Energy efficiency reduces loads that can happen. DR doesn't change what can happen. It changes when it happens. It still can happen, and the distribution network has to be ready to handle that peak load. Energy efficiency can permanently reduce the demand on that network in that location. So it's a different animal than DR. And that also, for other distributed resources, needs to be taken into account when you look at non-wireless alternatives. Is it a permanent reduction, so it defers a long time the investment in capital for demand for distribution or transmission upgrades, or is it simply displacing it in time, in which case that capacity still has to be there? So there's a time element and a permanency element that needs to be addressed in those analyses. That's one for the rough film. Any others? All right. We're at this point, and if there aren't any, we'll take a break. But if there are questions, I'm here, and I'll be here again, so you can deal with it an hour later.
Yeah, Tom, real quick, you included in this IRP that you did, obviously, for the Northwest, how many states were there? 5? 4. How did you go about looking at the diversity of the loads in each of those states? Because obviously some of them are very different, obviously. And you had
two different time zones.
And 2 different time zones, right. So you had to aggregate all that data up. Is that what you did? You
Yes.
did sort of a roll-up, if you will. And you took, I'm assuming, the individual load forecasts that were provided by the LFEs? Or
No.
How did you go about doing that?
Our load forecast is the ground-up load forecast by state. So we have a end-use econometric model representing each state. We roll that up into the region, and then the system look at a system load level for the region. Individual utilities occupy different footprints within that, and they do their own IRPs, whereas ours is a global look at if we optimize the system as a whole, what would it look like? Then we talk about individual IRPs. So, well, I don't have access, so I can't quite do that, but it gives them a better sense of the total. But it's a build-up. We're not doing like RTOs where they're just rolling it up. We've done that, and I'll talk about that in a second. Yeah.
I just had a question. You just mentioned something that's brought up to mind. Is here in Michigan, the statute is utility by utility IRP planning, as opposed to either a large regional IRP plan. Could you comment on the advantages of one way or the other?
Yeah, I'll touch upon this in a little bit, but I think there's an advantage in looking at it in aggregate, because particularly if there's a liquid market and utilities are trading things, if you all work together, one of the things that we found looking at the regional level is the differential in the haves and have-nots within the region allows you to balance the system without having to go to build additional resources, because some utilities will go along than others. And as a consequence, you could make the trade work, bilateral or otherwise, or expect the market to work, where you could, because you had existing inventory, you could use better across the region. It required less development. Now, making that actually happen, this is an optimized case. If you can't make that happen, costs just get higher. But it's worth trying because costs could be lower. So that's what we did. And I think that there's an advantage to making that. It's a lift, but it's also a valuable one because it can show you opportunities for internal resource sharing that would not otherwise show up.
Now, you're a federally chartered group, or?
The Power Council, Northwest Power Planning Council, was established in 1980 under a federal statute to do a long-range resource plan for the Northwest, 4 states, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And we've been in business since early 1981. Because Jimmy Carter signed the law in December 5th, and it took us a while to start up. He signed it in 80. Okay. Questions? Another question?
Just because I'm not terribly familiar with the Northwest, or as familiar as perhaps I should be. Do you guys have a wholesale power market or capacity market that you operate within?
No, it's a vertically integrated system. It has both IOUs and publics, but there's no RTO or ISO. We're strongly influenced by the Cal ISO because they present. We do have liquid wholesale markets. There's a NYMEX trading hub. 2 of them, one at the California Oregon border, one in mid-sea. So there is a liquid trading market there for spot, but there's no forward capacity market. And there isn't actually in California either. Cal ISO doesn't have it yet. They have an EIN. All right, why don't you take a break, and I guess, when do we re-kick?
So we'll be back after lunch at 1:30, right back in this room. Thank you.